Detective Sam Carter had always lived his life in a predictable rhythm. Wake up, work, go home, rinse and repeat. His apartment, nestled on the third floor of an aging building in the heart of the city, was his sanctuary from the chaos of his job. The dim light filtering through the cracked blinds was often the only comfort he had. The walls, adorned with minimal furniture and case files, served as a constant reminder of his dedication to the law. His life had been reduced to a quiet, solitary routine, which was exactly how he liked it. Sam's goals were simple: keep the streets safe, solve the cases, and avoid getting tangled in the personal messes that most of his colleagues found themselves in. He wasn't the most approachable guy at the precinct, and after his wife's sudden death 3 years ago in a car accident, he preferred it that way. Grief had hardened him, making it easier to push away the people who still cared about him. Even his estranged relationship with his sister Olivia had been put on pause. She reached out sometimes, but Sam kept her at arm's length. It was easier that way, less complicated. But tonight everything felt off. He had just finished working a case involving a missing person, another young woman who had vanished without a trace. He leaned back in his worn-out chair, rubbing his eyes, the weight of the case heavy on his shoulders. His head ached, a constant reminder of the pressure that came with being one of the city's top detectives. Yet, it wasn't the case that unsettled him tonight. It was something else, something unexplainable. The phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Sam hesitated for a second before answering. He didn't often get calls this late, and when he did, they were rarely good news. "Detective Carter," he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The silence on the other end stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Just as he was about to hang up, a voice, low, almost melodic, whispered into the receiver. "You're next, Sam." His pulse quickened. The voice sent a shiver down his spine, but he quickly masked his unease. It was probably some prank, maybe, a random caller messing with him. Still, a gnawing feeling began to grow in the pit of his stomach. "Who is this?" Sam demanded, but the line was dead. No dial tone, no static, just complete silence. He stared at the phone for a moment, trying to shake the lingering discomfort. The phone call felt too personal, too intentional. Sam dismissed it, tossing the phone back onto the table. As he did, his eyes wandered to the window, where the night outside seemed darker than usual. The streetlights below flickered intermittently, casting long, jagged shadows on the pavement. It was then that he noticed something strange, a figure across the street. A man, standing perfectly still, under the glow of the street lamp, his face obscured by the shadows. Sam squinted, trying to make out the figure's features. Was it a passerby? Just another person on the streets at this late hour? Or was it something more? His instincts, honed over years on the job, kicked in, but before he could take another step forward, the figure vanished. Sam blinked. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, a cold sweat beginning to form at the nape of his neck. Could the figure have been real? Was it just a trick of the mind, brought on by exhaustion and stress? A sudden knock at the door shattered his thoughts. Sam's heart raced as he approached the door cautiously. He wasn't expecting anyone. He hadn't invited anyone over, and the precinct knew better than to disturb him at this hour unless it was a case that needed immediate attention. His hand gripped the doorknob, but before he could open it, a voice, soft but distinct, called from the other side. "Sam, it's me. Open up." It was Olivia, his sister. The voice cracked with a faint tremor that Sam had never heard before. He hesitated. Olivia hadn't been to his apartment in months. She hadn't even called him, and yet here she was, calling to him, desperate and afraid. Something wasn't right. Sam slowly opened the door, only to find no one there. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the empty hallway. There was no sign of Olivia, only the cold draft sweeping through the narrow corridor. As he stepped back inside, he noticed something, an envelope lying on the floor just inside the door. He bent down to pick it up. The handwriting on the front was smudged, frantic. His name was scrawled in a way that seemed almost urgent. With a sense of dread, Sam tore open the envelope, revealing a single photograph. It was a picture of Olivia, but the image was distorted. Her face was twisted in an expression of terror, as though she had been caught mid-scream. Behind her, faint shadows of figures loomed, half hidden in the darkness. And then, written across the bottom of the photograph in the same erratic handwriting, were the words, "She's already gone." Sam's hands trembled as he dropped the photo. The room spun around him. He hadn't seen Olivia in days. She wasn't supposed to be here. So how did this picture appear? Who was behind this? Suddenly, a noise echoed from the darkness outside his apartment. A low scraping sound, like something, or someone, was moving in the hall. Sam's pulse quickened. His eyes darted around the room, his breath shallow. He could feel it, deep in his gut. Something was coming, something he couldn't escape. The door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into total darkness. And the whispers, they began. Sam's hand still trembled as he picked up the distorted photograph from the floor. The words on it, the eerie, jagged script, seemed to burn into his mind. "She's already gone." He had no idea what it meant, or who had sent it, but it was clear that something was horribly wrong. His thoughts spun in a blur, but one thing was painfully clear. Olivia had never come to his apartment. She hadn't called, and she had never left him a note. The last time they spoke, they hadn't exactly parted on good terms. Their relationship had become strained after their mother's death, and Olivia had blamed Sam for his distance, for the grief that had consumed him after his wife's tragic death. Still, Sam hadn't seen her in weeks. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the photograph wasn't just a warning, it was a message, a sign. Someone wanted him to believe something. Someone wanted him to see something. But what? Sam stood, frozen for a moment, heart pounding in his chest. The scraping noise from outside his door grew louder, drawing him from his thoughts. He crept toward the door, every instinct telling him to stay alert, stay quiet. His breath caught as the noise stopped abruptly, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a breath drawn too close to his ear. "Sam, Sam, you're not alone." His blood ran cold, but before he could act, the scraping resumed, louder this time, almost desperate. He stepped away from the door, his hands gripping his gun, just in case. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he wasn't about to open the door and face whatever was lurking in the hallway. Instead, Sam did what he always did when faced with something unknown. He investigated. His first thought was to call Olivia. He fumbled for his phone, but when he unlocked it, he saw something that made his stomach drop. There, in the call history, was a missed call from her. Only it was from several hours ago, long before the note had been delivered. His pulse quickened. Why hadn't she called him earlier? And why did it feel as though she was trying to reach him from beyond the grave? Without wasting any more time, Sam grabbed his jacket, his mind racing with unanswered questions. If there was one thing he knew, it was that Olivia wouldn't have left him a cryptic message like the one in the photo. She wouldn't have done that to him. So where was she? And more importantly, why hadn't he noticed something was wrong sooner? The city outside his apartment felt suffocating, its streets teeming with noise, but for Sam, they might as well have been dead quiet. He felt like a man caught in a never-ending nightmare, where the line between reality and delusion blurred. Every time he tried to make sense of it all, Sam's mind kept returning to the phone call, the whisper that had sent a chill down his spine. It was so familiar, so intimate, and yet wrong. It felt like someone had been watching him for longer than he realized. That unnerving sense of being followed lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing at him with every step he took. He knew he had to find Olivia, and fast. The abandoned building she had lived in just a few blocks away was his first stop. Her apartment was small and tucked away on the fourth floor of a crumbling building where the lights never seemed to work, and the air always smelled faintly of mildew. Sam had been there a dozen times before, but tonight it felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he stepped into the lobby. the dim fluorescent lights flickering above him. He could hear the faint hum of something in the distance, like an old fan running, but louder. It was a constant, steady hum that felt as though it was seeping through the walls, vibrating beneath his feet. As Sam climbed the stairs to Olivia's floor, his thoughts swirled. His gut told him this was no ordinary missing persons case. There was something darker at play here. Someone, or something, was pulling the strings, manipulating every step of the way. When he reached her door, he hesitated. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside. His hand hovered over the doorknob. As he turned it slowly, the door creaked open, revealing an empty apartment, the air thick with the smell of something sweet and rancid all at once. Sam stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The apartment was exactly as he remembered it, save for one detail. The walls were covered in symbols. They were hastily scrawled, drawn in what looked like black marker as though someone had been trying to mark off a ritualistic path. The symbols were strange, foreign, almost ancient. At first, Sam thought he was imagining things, but as he stepped closer, he realized they were everywhere. On the walls, the floors, even on the ceiling. They seemed to pulse, as though they were alive. A cold breeze swept through the apartment, making the air feel impossibly colder, and then a voice. Soft, muffled, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "She's closer than you think." Sam's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just in his head, it was real. It was in the room with him. The door slammed shut behind him with a violent bang. His heart pounded as his eyes darted around the room. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the symbols, they shifted. He was in too deep now. There was no turning back. Suddenly, in the dim light of the room, a shadow appeared in the corner of his vision. It was tall, shifting unnaturally, as though it were made of smoke. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He was certain he could see something moving, something alive in the darkness watching him. The shadow loomed, its edges blurring in and out of focus, its presence suffocating. "You're next," the voice whispered again. Sam's hand went instinctively to his gun, but it felt heavy, like a useless weight. He was no longer just searching for Olivia. He was fighting for his life. Sam couldn't sleep. The shadows in Olivia's apartment still lingered in his mind, the whispering voice echoing in the silence of his apartment. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting, watching. The message, the photograph, the symbols, kept repeating in his thoughts like a broken record. He had to figure out what was happening and, more importantly, where Olivia was. The next morning, Sam made a decision. He would leave no stone unturned. He needed answers, but he also knew that time was running out. The symbols in Olivia's apartment kept haunting him, their cryptic lines and swirling patterns taking up too much space in his mind. So he visited the one person who might be able to provide insight, Professor Clark, an expert in occult and esoteric practices. Sam had met him during his university days. Clark had been a guest lecturer for a course he took on supernatural phenomena and paranormal investigations. At the time, Sam had brushed it off as nonsense, but now, with everything that had happened, he wasn't so sure. Sam sat in Clark's cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of old books and burning incense. The professor was in his late 50s, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. As Sam explained the events of the past few days, Clark listened intently, his brow furrowed. "This is worse than I thought," Clark muttered, staring at the symbols Sam had sketched in his notebook. "These aren't just random markings, they're part of an ancient ritual. A summoning, if you will." "Summoning? What kind of summoning?" Sam asked, leaning forward. He felt a knot of dread form in his stomach. Clark hesitated, glancing around the room as though to make sure no one else was listening. "A curse or something worse. It's tied to a being that preys on grief and guilt. It feeds on the pain of its victims, growing stronger with each torment." Sam's heart raced. It sounded insane, but everything about the past few days Everything he had experienced felt too real to be dismissed. Something was happening, something that defied explanation. Clark leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The whispers you're hearing, they're the first sign. They'll come more frequently now, each time more insistent. The entity is trying to break you. It wants you to doubt your sanity, to make you question everything. He paused, eyeing Sam carefully. And the worst part? If you try to stop it, it'll turn on you. It doesn't take kindly to those who resist. Sam felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just a bad dream. This was real, and it was getting worse. Clark reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old, tattered book. Its pages were yellowed with age, the cover cracked and worn. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a specific entry. This, Clark said, pointing to an illustration of a dark figure with glowing eyes, its shape both humanoid and otherworldly, is what you're dealing with. The Dark One. It has many names, but it's always the same entity. It's ancient, powerful, and relentless. Sam's eyes traced the image, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. The figure in the drawing looked eerily familiar, its shape matching the shadow he had seen in Olivia's apartment. His stomach churned. How do I stop it? Clark's gaze grew heavy with warning. You don't. Not easily. The Dark One cannot be destroyed, only contained, if you're lucky. But it's not a matter of strength or weapons. It feeds on your fear, your pain. It's a creature of manipulation. If you're determined to end this, you need to find the source of its power, the ritual that summoned it. Without that, you'll be nothing more than a pawn in its game. Before Sam could respond, Clark's phone rang, cutting their conversation short. He waved Sam out of the room with a tight smile. I'll look into it more, but be careful. The more you search, the more dangerous it gets. Sam left Clark's office, his mind racing. The more he learned, the less he understood. Every step forward seemed to push him deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As he made his way back to his apartment, a cold wind swept through the streets. The city felt unnervingly still, as though it too were holding its breath. When Sam reached his building, something caught his eye. A figure standing in the alleyway near the entrance. It was too far to make out clearly, but the silhouette sent a wave of unease through him. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form seemed to flicker in and out of focus. Sam froze, his pulse quickening. The figure didn't move. It just stood, there watching him. With no other choice, Sam pulled out his gun and approached cautiously. His footsteps echoed through the alley, louder than they should have been. As he neared the shadow, a voice, low and guttural, whispered from the dark. She's closer now. She's calling to you. Sam stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice wasn't just a whisper this time, it was clear, direct, and full of malice. He couldn't see the figure's face, but the words were enough. This wasn't a person. This wasn't even human. The shadow moved then, taking a step forward, its features still obscured in darkness. It was like something out of a nightmare, its shape distorting as though it existed between worlds. Get back, Sam growled, aiming, his gun at the creature. But the words came out weak, trembling with fear. He didn't want to shoot. It didn't feel like it would do any good. The shadow continued to move, its form growing more distinct, until it was standing in front of Sam just a few feet away, and then the whisper came again, this time directly in his ear. Your search ends now. Before Sam could react, the figure lunged at him. The world went black. Sam awoke in his apartment hours later, his body stiff and sore, the sharp tang of fear still heavy in his chest. The shadow had been real, too real. But when he reached for his phone to check the time, he found it cracked as though it had been dropped from a great height. The screen flickered before going black, rendering it useless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him back. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his mind even when no one was around. He had barely stepped out of his bed before the first cold shiver crept down his spine, the air around him thickening, suffocating. The darkness of his apartment had taken on a presence of its own, pressing against him from all sides. The more Sam tried to ignore it, the more the whispers grew. His thoughts were no longer his own. The entity, whatever it was inside his head now, gnawing away at his sanity. The line between what was real and what was in his mind had begun to blur. He couldn't trust his senses anymore. The shadow had followed him here. The phone call with Clark replayed in his mind, the professor's words ringing true with a weight that felt heavier every passing hour. It feeds on grief, on guilt. Sam knew now that this wasn't some fleeting nightmare. He was the target of something far worse than he could understand. And the more he fought it, the more it crept into his life, into his every thought, every breath. The entity's rules were simple but brutal. It only comes when you're alone. It feeds on your most intimate fears, your regrets, your losses. And once it finds a way in, it doesn't let go. It doesn't need to kill you to destroy you. It just needs to break you from the inside out. As the days passed, Sam's world began to fracture. He couldn't sleep anymore, the nightmares bleeding into his waking hours. Every corner of his apartment felt like a potential trap. Every creak of the floorboards a warning that something was watching. And the whispers, always the whispers. Soft at first, then louder, insistent, demanding. It's your fault. You killed her. He tried to reach out to his friends, but every conversation felt empty, as though a distance had opened up between them. He couldn't explain to them what was happening. They wouldn't understand, and the last thing he wanted was to drag them into his nightmare. Then came the first loss. It was subtle at first, just an odd absence that couldn't be explained. Rachel, his best friend and roommate, had always been the type to leave behind a mess, never one to keep secrets. But when Sam came home one evening to find her room empty, her belongings untouched, a sickening knot formed in his stomach. He tried calling her, texting her, but there was no answer. When he checked her social media, her accounts had been deleted. It was like she had never existed. At first, Sam tried to convince himself that she was just avoiding him, perhaps moving out on her own. But deep down, he knew better. The entity wasn't just toying with him. It was targeting those around him, cutting him off from any support, slowly suffocating him. Rachel wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. It wasn't long before Sam discovered the hidden journal under Rachel's bed. It had been there for weeks, maybe longer, buried beneath a stack of old notebooks. The pages were stained, frayed at the edges, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Rachel's. It detailed strange occurrences, just like the ones Sam had experienced. Whispers at night, shadows that moved against the light. And then, the revelation. Rachel had heard the whispers too. According to the journal, Rachel had tried to fight it. She'd researched the same rituals Sam had, even gone so far as to seek out a local medium. The medium had warned her about the entity, telling her it thrived on isolation and fear. Once you're chosen, there's no escape. The entity feeds on your darkest moments, your deepest regrets. If you don't confront it, it will consume everything you hold dear. Sam felt a cold grip tighten around his heart as he read the final entry. Rachel's handwriting was shaky, like she'd written it in a state of panic. The last words read, "It's here. It's coming for me. I can't escape." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, shattering the silence. Sam jumped up, his heart racing. He didn't need to check to know what had happened. The fridge door was open, the glass jar of jam shattered on the floor. His vision blurred as his thoughts raced, the whispers growing louder. "It's too late, Sam. You're already broken." He turned around, his mind reeling. And there, standing in the doorway, was the same figure he had seen before, the shadow. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and the air around it hummed with a low guttural sound, like 1,000 whispers pressed together into one unified voice. The shadow's lips twisted into a sickening grin as it spoke in a voice that made Sam's blood run cold. "It's over. The curse has already claimed you." Sam's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The figure moved toward him slowly, its presence growing stronger, pressing him down with an invisible weight. Sam's mind was spiraling, the guilt over Rachel's disappearance crashing over him in waves. He hadn't saved her. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. The shadow reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushing against his cheek, sending a cold shiver through his body. The more you try to resist, the more you'll lose, it whispered. It's already too late for you. In that moment, Sam understood. The entity wasn't just after him. It was after everyone he had ever loved, everyone who had ever been close to him. It thrived on isolation, fear, and guilt. As long as Sam remained connected to his past, to his regrets, he would never be free. He had to sever every tie, every connection that kept him tethered to his former life. But the more he tried to fight, the more the curse dug its claws into him. As the figure loomed over him, Sam realized the full extent of what he was dealing with. There was no escape, no way out. The curse would continue until there was nothing left of him but the shadows. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon when Sam found himself standing in front of the old library in the heart of the city. Its stone exterior loomed like a monument to forgotten knowledge, dark and imposing. The dim light from a street lamp flickered nervously, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked pavement. Sam had never paid much attention to the library before, but now, in the dead of night, it felt like the last place that might hold the answers he desperately needed. Every step he took toward it was one closer to uncovering the truth, but also one step deeper into the darkness he had tried to escape. Sam's mind was spinning with thoughts of Rachel, of the journal he had found, her last moments etched in, her handwriting like a cryptic plea. The shadow had taken her, and now it was coming for him. It wasn't just about guilt anymore. It was about survival. He needed to know what he was up against, needed to understand how to end this before it consumed him completely. The library doors creaked open with a groan as Sam stepped inside. The smell of old paper, dust, and mildew hit him immediately, thick and suffocating. The silence was almost oppressive, the kind of silence that wraps around you and suffocates every thought. He glanced around, his pulse quickening. The vast, dimly lit room stretched out before him, rows of ancient shelves towering like ominous sentinels. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of years and knowledge. In the back, an elderly librarian with wild white hair sat hunched over a desk, scribbling something in a notebook. Her eyes flickered up as Sam approached, a knowing look in her gaze. She'd been here long enough to understand that anyone who came in at this hour was rarely just a regular visitor. "What brings you here, son?" she asked, her voice raspy, but sharp, like it had seen 100 years of secrets. "Looking for something in particular?" Sam hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He could feel the weight of his questions pressing on him, questions he wasn't sure he even wanted the answers to. "I need to know about an entity, something dark, something that's been haunting me and taking people." The librarian didn't flinch. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're asking. Some things are better left unknown." "I don't have a choice," Sam insisted, his voice trembling slightly. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the unspoken understanding in her eyes. "I have to stop it before it takes everything from me." The librarian didn't answer at first. Instead, she reached for a thick, dust-covered book on the shelf behind her. The spine cracked as she opened it, her fingers tracing the pages with familiarity. She flipped through the brittle pages until she stopped, her finger hovering over a section that Sam couldn't see. This isn't a story you can just read in a book," she murmured, almost to herself. "But I suppose you've come this far." She looked up at him, her eyes, now dark with a mixture of warning and pity. "It's been here longer than anyone remembers. It feeds on the living, on the ones with the most to lose. Guilt, grief, loss. It makes you relive your worst moments, your worst fears, until there's nothing left of you. The shadow, it has no form. It takes the shape of whatever will hurt you the most. The more it feeds, the more powerful it becomes. Sam swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt his knees buckle beneath him, the weight of the words pressing down on him like a physical force. But how do I stop it? How do I get rid of it? The librarian's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in it. You can't stop it, not by normal means. The curse, the entity, it's part of this place. Part of something much older, much darker. It's been passed down through generations, its presence lingering like a shadow. Once it's marked you, it will follow. It will never leave. You're already caught in its web. Sam shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. No. There has to be something, a way to fight back. The librarian gave him a pitying look, as if she'd seen many like him. People who thought they could escape something like this. The only way to sever the curse is to face it head on. But you'll have to go deeper than you've ever gone before. The entity doesn't just feed on your fears. It thrives on your connections, on the bonds you've formed with others. If you truly want to survive, you'll have to cut yourself off from everything. Everyone. Sam's mind reeled. The idea of severing his last connections, of losing everything that kept him grounded, made his stomach twist with horror. Could he really do that? What happens if I don't? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. The librarian's eyes flickered with something like fear, but her lips never moved. Before Sam could ask anything further, the shadows around him seemed to shift, creeping toward him like tendrils of smoke. His heart raced in his chest. The whispers were back, louder now, clawing at his thoughts. It's too late for you. Sam looked up, but the library was still. The librarian had vanished, her desk empty. The room around him was now cold, the once familiar shelves feeling as if they were closing in on him, suffocating him. The whispers had turned into guttural voices, echoes of every moment of pain, every regret, every fear he had ever known. His vision swam as the world around him distorted. A shadow, long and stretched, emerged from the dark corners of the room. Sam's breath caught in his throat. There, standing before him, was the thing, the entity. Its glowing eyes flickered with an otherworldly hunger, and the air around it crackled with the same low hum that had haunted him since the first night. You should have never come here, it whispered, its voice a hiss of malice. You think you can escape me? You think you can stop me? The shadow took a step closer, its presence overwhelming. Sam stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as he remembered the librarian's warning. You're already marked. In that moment, Sam knew there was no running, no hiding. He had come too far. And now, the entity was real, standing right before him. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. He was a part of this twisted, eternal game. But something inside him sparked. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. He couldn't let it win, not without a fight. As the entity loomed closer, Sam reached into his pocket and gripped the pages of Rachel's journal, his last connection to her. He needed answers, and if the entity wanted to take him, it would have to take everything he had. The world around him was closing in, but Sam had just begun his fight. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety, dread, and sleepless nights. Sam had tried everything he could think of. He isolated himself, he stopped answering the phone, and he avoided going to the places he once felt safe. He even threw out Rachel's journal, but it was like he could still feel its weight in his pocket, like it was always with him, lurking just beneath the surface. Every corner of his apartment now felt like a trap. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing longer each day. He couldn't sleep, not that it mattered. His mind was too clouded by whispers, faint and distant, always just out of reach. The entity had promised it would take him, and as the days wore on, Sam could feel the darkness creeping in, taking hold of everything he once knew. The first sign that the rules had begun to break came in the form of a dream. But it was no ordinary dream. Sam was in a place that felt both familiar and wrong. The world around him was bathed in an unsettling dim light, and the air tasted like rust. A house, or something like it, stood at the center of the dream, its windows like hollow eyes, dark and empty. Sam stepped inside, his heart pounding with the realization that he had been here before. But this wasn't a memory. This was something else, something that didn't make sense. The house was both his and not his, and it was crumbling. Its walls cracked and splintered as if reality itself was decaying. The whispers began to grow louder, curling around him like tendrils of smoke. "You cannot hide, Sam. It's never been about hiding." Suddenly the door slammed shut behind him, and the light flickered out, plunging him into darkness. His breath caught in his throat as a figure moved in the blackness, a shape that he knew all too well, the shadow. It was here, but this time, it wasn't just standing still in the corner of his vision. It was coming for him. He tried to move, but his feet wouldn't obey. The floor beneath him seemed to soften, as if he was sinking into it, becoming part of the nightmare. The whisper grew into a growl, jagged and seething as the entity loomed closer. "I warned you not to look into my eyes, Sam, but now you will see the truth." Sam's heart raced, but before he could react, the figure was gone. He woke up with a start, gasping for air as if the weight of the dream had crushed him. His body felt cold, drenched in sweat. But what troubled him more was the feeling that the dream hadn't been a dream at all. The shadow had followed him just as the librarian had said it would. It was no longer bound by rules, no longer confined to the night or to the realm of sleep. It was in the waking world now, bleeding into reality. Sam pushed himself out of bed, heart pounding, and stumbled toward the kitchen. He tried to shake the images from his mind, but they clung to him, wrapping around him like a vice. The apartment was silent, too silent, and every creak of the floorboard sent a jolt through his spine. He glanced at the clock. 3:14 a.m., the hour when things felt most vulnerable. A soft sound came from the living room, almost like a whisper, but not quite. He froze, his blood running cold as he turned toward the door. A shadow passed beneath the door frame. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He knew it wasn't his imagination. His pulse quickened, his fingers trembling as they gripped the door handle. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to face whatever had been stalking him through his dreams. But he had no choice. He had to know. The door creaked open. Nothing. The living room was empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the streetlights outside. But there, on the coffee table, was something new. Something that shouldn't be there. A photograph of Rachel, face twisted in terror, her eyes wide with fear. But what chilled Sam the most wasn't the photo itself. It was the faint shadow behind her. A shadow that wasn't there before, a dark silhouette creeping just out of frame. "You are not alone, Sam." The words were a whisper, not in the air but in his mind. They felt like cold fingers brushing against his thoughts. Sam dropped the photograph, his hands shaking as the realization hit him like a physical blow. It had found him. The rules were gone. The boundaries between the dream world and the real world were no longer clear. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room, but the shadows felt thicker now, more oppressive. They pressed against him, the very air around him feeling suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. His vision blurred, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then from the corner of his eye he saw it. A shape in the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light. A flicker of movement. Sam's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't imagining this. The shadow was here in his home, and it was closer than ever. It wasn't confined to the places he had feared, his nightmares, the dark corners. It had followed him, breached the walls between the worlds. The whisper returned, louder now, sharper. "I am everything you fear, Sam. I am the guilt you carry, the isolation you've built. I will be your undoing." Sam staggered backward, his mind spiraling. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't outrun it. Every step he took, every place he hid, the shadow was there. It had become part of him, fed on his fear, his grief, and it wasn't going to let him go. In a moment of clarity, Sam realized something crucial. The rules hadn't just been broken, they had changed, And as he turned to face the shadow once more, he could no longer tell where his mind ended and the nightmare began. The night was suffocating. Sam sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photograph of Rachel that now seemed like the only thing anchoring him to reality. His hands trembled as he traced the edges of the picture with a finger. She had been the one to bring him here, to this apartment, to this life. But that life, it seemed, was slipping further and further away. The whispers had not stopped. They were louder, more insistent, constantly pressing against his mind, shaping his thoughts. And they were always there, lingering in the shadows, in the air around him, in the corners of his vision. "You brought this upon yourself," the voice whispered in his ear, though no one was there. "And you will pay for it." His mind was breaking. He knew that. But deep down, there was still one question that gnawed at him relentlessly. Why Rachel? Why her out of everyone he knew? She wasn't a stranger to him, no, she was his anchor. She was the one person who understood his deepest fears, his past. The one person who always kept him grounded. But there was more to Rachel's disappearance than he had ever realized. He didn't know why it had taken him so long to put the pieces together. But now, as he sat in the dim light of the kitchen, it all made sense. His guilt, his isolation, it had all been leading him here. The shadow, the entity, hadn't just followed him. It had followed her. It had latched onto her the moment she'd stepped into his life. And he was just a pawn in a much darker game, a game he had no control over. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. The entity didn't just want him. It wanted Rachel, too. It had been there, waiting for her to make the mistake that would seal her fate. And he had been the one to unknowingly give it the power it needed to drag her into this nightmare. Sam's breath caught in his throat. The truth was right there, in front of him, staring him in the face. The entity had never been after him at all. It had been after Rachel. And now it had found a way to get to her, through him. But how? The answer was disturbingly simple. His eyes darted to the shelf across the room where Rachel's journal still sat. He had thrown it away, but it seemed like it had always been waiting for him to open it again. The journal had been her refuge, her space to work through the darkness in her own mind. But what if it had also been the key to unlocking the curse? What if Rachel had summoned it? The thought made him feel cold, like ice was running through his veins. But as he flipped open the journal, Sam realized that it wasn't just a tool for expression. It was a manual, a record of everything Rachel had done, everything she had uncovered about the entity before her disappearance. She had known. She had always known that something was following her, waiting, and in the desperation to find answers, she had made a mistake. She had tried to communicate with the entity. She had done something, some ritual, some invocation that had drawn it to her, and now it was too late. The entity had found a way to latch on, to infest her life, her very being, and now it had gone beyond her, using Sam as a bridge to the real world. The rules had been broken, the boundaries dissolved. He flipped through the pages feverishly, each one more cryptic than the last, symbols and drawings that made no sense to him, words and languages he didn't recognize, phrases that twisted in on themselves. But then he came to one page, a single sentence that stood out among the chaos. It was written in bold, desperate letters. "I am sorry, Sam. You were never meant to be part of this. I should never have searched for the answers." Sam's breath stopped. "I should never have searched for the answers." The words repeated in his mind, and for the first time since Rachel's disappearance, he understood her. She had been trying to fix something she couldn't undo. And in her desperation, in her grief over their shared past, she had opened a door to a world that neither of them could ever have understood. A world of shadows, curses, and unspeakable horrors. But now that door was open, and it wasn't going to close. A distant noise broke him from his thoughts. A knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not at this hour. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and Sam froze. His body stiffened as dread seeped into his bones. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to swell, pressing in on him from all sides. Another knock. This time it wasn't just a knock, it was a bang, forceful and unnatural. A sound that rattled the entire apartment. Sam's pulse raced. He stepped slowly toward the door, his breath shallow. The whispers returned, louder than ever, twisting in his mind. The thing, the shadow, it was here. And it wasn't just lurking anymore. It was inside his home. With trembling hands, he reached for the door handle. His mind screamed at him to stop. He had seen the shadows before. But this time, he knew they weren't just a figment of his imagination. The door swung open with a creak, and standing there, bathed in the flickering light of the hallway, was Rachel. Her face was pale, her eyes empty, like two dark pools that had swallowed everything in their path. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and she was trembling, but not with fear. She was wrong. Sam, her voice cracked, a low whisper. It's too late. It's already begun. The moment she spoke, the shadows behind her surged forward, swallowing the hallway whole. Sam had made a terrible mistake, and now there was no turning back. Sam's breath was ragged as he clutched Rachel's journal to his chest, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The shadows were closing in again. He could feel their cold, suffocating presence in the very air around him. But now, there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread of possibility. He had uncovered something in Rachel's journal, that might give him a chance to end this nightmare once and for all. The ritual. He'd found it hidden between the lines of her scrawled notes, a desperate attempt to communicate with the entity. She had tried to stop it, but instead she had only made it stronger. But the ritual, there had to be a way to reverse it. He was convinced of it. He had to act quickly before it consumed him completely, before the entity took everything. The dead of night, he prepared. He gathered the items he needed, candles, symbols, salt, the herbs Rachel had mentioned in the journal. His hands shook as he set up the makeshift altar in the center of the room, the dim light of the candles casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. His heart hammered in his chest as he muttered the incantation under his breath, praying that it would work. For a brief moment, everything fell silent. The room grew colder, the shadows more pronounced. And then, just as he had hoped, the whispers stopped. The darkness seemed to recede. The air felt less oppressive, less suffocating. The oppressive weight of the entity's presence lifted. If, only for a moment, it was working. But Sam didn't know that the entity, like all malevolent forces, had never played by the rules. What Rachel had failed to understand, and what Sam was about to learn the hard way, was that the entity was always 2 steps ahead, and it didn't need a ritual to break free. It only needed a moment of weakness. A creaking sound echoed from the far corner of the room, drawing Sam's attention. His pulse quickened as the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, pulling the darkness into themselves. And then, with a sudden surge of violent energy, everything shattered. The walls seemed to bend inward, the room collapsing in on itself as the temperature dropped to an impossible level. The entity was back, and it was angrier than ever. The candles flickered out, their light swallowed by the growing darkness. Sam barely had time to react before the shadows began to pulse, thick and writhing, their tendrils stretching toward him. The whispers returned, now louder than ever, like a cacophony of voices echoing in his skull. His body trembled, his mind reeling as the entity's cold grasp tightened around him. You thought you could control it? The voice was a deep, guttural whisper, full of malice. You are nothing but a fool. And now, you will suffer for it. Sam staggered back, his breath ragged as he tried to escape. But the shadows followed, relentless and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on him, the very air growing thick with malevolent energy. There was no escape, no way out. The ritual had been a lie, a false solution. The entity had tricked him into believing that he could stop it, but now it was too late. The truth was far worse than he could have ever imagined. Sam knew he had to act, but he was running out of time. The shadows were everywhere now, filling every corner of the room, creeping into his very soul. The air was thick with despair, with guilt, and with the overwhelming sense that he was being crushed under an unbearable weight. He could feel it pressing in on him, on his mind, on his body, on his very soul. In his panic, he rushed toward the door, only to find that it was locked, barred from the inside. He turned toward the window, but it was too late. The shadows had already seeped into every crevice of the room, and they were closing in on him with terrifying speed. The entity's laughter filled the room, low and mocking, as if it reveled in his misery. "You can't escape it, Sam. You can't escape yourself. You were always part of this. Always." The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The entity didn't just feed on guilt. It created it. It had been feeding off of his guilt. From the moment he had entered this apartment, his fear, his anxiety, his grief, they were all like food to it. It had been manipulating him from the very beginning, playing on his weaknesses until he had brought Rachel into this mess, until he had brought it into his life. But now, in his desperation, he realized something else. It wasn't just him. It had targeted others before him, people who had lost their way, people who had made the same mistakes. And it wouldn't stop with him. It never stopped. In the final desperate moments, he understood what he had to do. There was no escape. There was only one way to stop the entity from continuing its reign of terror. He had to let go. He had to release his hold on his grief, his guilt. He had to accept the truth, even if it meant losing everything. His heart ached as he thought of Rachel. She had been the one to suffer most. She had been the one the entity had sought from the very beginning. But her fate was tied to his own, and now, the only way to stop the cycle was for him to make the ultimate sacrifice. Sam stood in the center of the room, the shadows pressing against him, suffocating him. His mind reeled, but there was no other choice. The whispers had become a deafening roar, clawing at his sanity, and he knew that if he didn't act now, it would be too late. He could feel his body trembling, his thoughts slipping away as the weight of his decision settled in. It was the only way. With trembling hands, he reached for the knife he had hidden in his jacket. It was sharp, and it glinted in the dim light of the room. He closed his eyes for a moment, the image of Rachel flashing in his mind. He had failed her. He had failed himself. But this was the only way to stop the entity, to stop it from consuming them both. The knife was cool against his skin as he pressed it to his chest. He whispered her name, his voice trembling before making the incision. Pain shot through him, but he didn't flinch. This was the price of defiance. This was the price of trying to control something so dark, so ancient, that it had always been beyond his understanding, and as the blood flowed from his wound, the shadows seemed to recoil. The entity's laughter faded, its whispers dying down. The pressure in the room lifted, and for a fleeting moment, Sam thought that he had succeeded. But then everything went dark. Sam's last breath came with a final realization. He had won, but at a terrible cost. Rachel's face appeared before him, but it was too late. The entity had already claimed her soul, and now it would consume his too. The shadows closed in, and the world fell silent. The price of sacrifice was paid, but the horror never ended. Sam's pulse raced in his ears as he stumbled through the darkness, his body burning with exhaustion and pain. The blood from his wound had long since dried, but the shadows around him had only grown stronger, thicker. The air was oppressive, filled with a sense of finality, the moment when everything would either end or devour him entirely. He had thought the sacrifice would be enough. He had believed that by giving up his own life force, by surrendering his grief and guilt, the entity would be stopped. But instead, it had only gained more power, more control. Sam's heart pounded, and he knew that there was one last chance to end this nightmare. And it wasn't in a ritual. It wasn't in running. It was in confronting the truth. The room was silent except for the whispering, a constant, nauseating, hum that had become part of his existence. But tonight it was different. The whispers didn't echo from the walls. They came from his own mind. The entity was inside him now, its presence invading his thoughts, twisting his every memory. The floor beneath him creaked as he moved, but he could feel it. Feel the entity watching, waiting, circling. "You can't escape it, Sam. You are part of me now," the voice whispered, like a caress in his ear. "You always have been." Sam's head snapped up as he reached the center of the room. His heart skipped a beat as the shadows coalesced in front of him, gathering into a shape. It was no longer the formless blackness that had haunted him, but something solid, something humanoid, its edges blurred and shifting like smoke. Eyes, dark, soulless voids, locked onto his. This was it. The confrontation. His worst fear standing, right in front of him. "Do you see it now?" the entity hissed. "Do you understand who I am? What I am? You thought you could defeat me with your rituals, your sacrifice, but you're wrong. I was never after your life. I was after your soul, your memories. The guilt that you hold so dear, Sam." Sam recoiled, the weight of the entity's words settling in his chest. The pieces clicked together like the final turn of a lock. It had never been just a malevolent spirit, a curse he could defeat. It had always been tied to him. His guilt, his unresolved pain, had summoned it. Rachel wasn't the only victim. It had always been connected to him, to his own dark secrets, his own past. The entity grinned, its twisted smile stretching unnaturally wide. "I am your fear, Sam. I am your past. I am the thing that you've tried to bury. You cannot outrun me." With a scream, Sam charged forward, the last remnants of his strength propelling him toward the figure in the dark. His fist collided with the entity's form, but it was like striking smoke. His hand passed right through it, his body faltering as a wave of dizziness hit him. The entity laughed, its form flickering with cruel amusement. "Did you really think you could fight me?" it mocked, as it wrapped its shadows around Sam's legs, pulling him down to the floor. "I've been inside you all along. Your guilt, your pain, they're mine to feed on." Sam's breath hitched as he struggled, but the shadows tightened, binding him in place. His mind reeled, flashes of memories tearing through his consciousness. The argument with Rachel, the way he had failed her, the moments of doubt he had never confronted, the selfishness that had caused her pain. The guilt consumed him, but he knew deep down that the only way out was to stop hiding from it. He had to face his past. "You have no power over me anymore," Sam whispered through clenched teeth. The words didn't feel right, but they were the only thing that felt like a lifeline. "You are nothing but a reflection of my mistakes." The entity paused, its form flickering like a dying flame. The room seemed to grow colder, and Sam could feel his chest tighten as something inside him snapped. Something inside him let go. He had spent so long running, so long hiding from his mistakes, that he had forgotten that the only way to free himself was to accept them, to face them head on. "I won't let you consume me," he repeated, his voice stronger this time. The shadows recoiled as if stung. He pushed against them, his mind filled with clarity. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. I know what you are." The entity screeched, its form distorting in pain. Sam's vision blurred, but he held firm, standing tall in the face of his own fears. His heart thudded in his chest, his blood pulsing with a new fire, and in that moment everything in the room seemed to shift. The shadows, once oppressive, seemed to dissipate as the entity shrieked in fury. "You can't defeat me," it bellowed, its voice twisting into something inhuman. "You're nothing but a broken man." But Sam didn't falter. He was broken. But he had learned the most important lesson of all. His guilt didn't define him. He would never be free of it completely, but he could choose to live despite it. The shadows were beginning to dissolve, no longer having the power to control him. The entity's form flickered violently, its shape collapsing in on itself as Sam pushed forward. He could see it now. The thing that had haunted him for so long was not a physical force. It was a reflection of his own mind, a distortion of his darkest thoughts, a twisted part of himself that he had allowed to grow. And just like that, it was gone. The room was silent. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted. Sam stood alone in the center of the room, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his face. But he was free. For now. Sam sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the dimming sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange calm, the kind that felt more unsettling than peaceful. He could still feel the weight of the darkness pressing against him, even though the room was filled with light now. His heart had slowed, but the silence seemed to echo louder than any scream he had ever heard. He had survived. But at what cost? The loss of Rachel still hung heavy in his chest, an empty void where her laughter used to reside. He hadn't just lost her. He had lost the person he could have been, the version of himself that might have lived differently, might have confronted his demons before they consumed him. The thought made him sick to his stomach. The entity was gone, or so he told himself. Its presence had shattered into the air like smoke, dissipating the moment Sam had faced the truth of his own guilt. But as he sat in the quiet, a faint whisper flickered at the edges of his mind like a stray thought that wouldn't leave. His breath caught in his throat as the whisper slid through his thoughts. "You can't escape me, Sam." The voice was unmistakable. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor as his heart leaped in his chest. The room felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He tried to shake the thought away. It was over. He had ended it. Or had he? A soft knock echoed through the hallway. Sam froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. His fingers twitched as they hovered near the door handle, but he didn't move. He didn't want to move. His body was stiff, as if something had paralyzed him, but his mind raced. That knock, it was different. The sound was too deliberate, too knowing. The whispers intensified in his head. "Let me in, Sam." The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he felt the darkness pressing at the edges of the room, the atmosphere thick with something malevolent, something that shouldn't be there. The knock came again, louder this time. Sam's hand clenched into a fist, his breath shallow. Slowly, he reached for the door, forcing himself to step forward, knowing deep down that it was a terrible idea, but he had to know. He opened the door. Nothing. Just the empty hallway, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows along the floor. No one was there, but the air, thick and heavy, remained, hanging in the silence like a suffocating fog. His mind raced. He could feel it now. The presence, the weight of something still lingering in the corners of the room. The whispers had faded into the stillness, but they hadn't gone away. They were waiting. Sam turned back, closing the door quietly behind him, his mind spinning. He knew better than to think it was over. Not yet. The entity hadn't been fully destroyed. It had only been hidden, buried beneath the surface. The deeper he tried to bury his past, the louder it became, and now he was paying the price. He sank back onto the bed, running a hand through his hair. A flash of movement caught his eye, a shadow darting past the window, too quick to be real. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, his breath catching in his throat. The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, as if they were breathing. Was it still out there? Had it never truly left? Sam's eyes flickered to the old photo of him and Rachel on the nightstand, their smiles frozen in time. It was a painful reminder of what was lost, but it was also the last piece of his humanity he had left. The darkness wanted to take even that from him. A sound broke through the silence, a low, creaking noise from the closet. Sam's heart leaped in his chest as he jumped to his feet, his muscles tense, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he didn't. He couldn't. He had to know what it was. He approached the closet, the whispers in his mind growing louder, more frantic, more desperate. "You know it's not over, Sam. You know this isn't real." The door creaked open. Nothing. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the empty space inside. But then, he saw it. The faintest trace of something in the corner, a shadow that wasn't quite right. He stepped forward, reaching for the coat hanging on the rack, but his fingers froze mid-air. There, in the reflection of the closet door, standing just behind him in the corner of the room, was a figure. Not just any figure. The entity. It was back. And it was waiting. Sam's blood ran cold as the figure reached out for him, its hollow eyes locking onto his with a terrible certainty. The whispers flooded his mind once again, louder than before. You can't escape me. You will never escape me. The shadows closed in and the room seemed to disappear as the past, the guilt, the fear, the thing that had haunted him, drowned him in its relentless grasp. And somewhere deep inside, Sam knew it was only just beginning. It had been 6 months since Sam had returned to the world, and the weight of the past still clung to him like a second skin. His home was different now, colder, quieter, as though the very air had changed in the wake of everything that had happened. The walls, once so familiar, seemed like strangers now, echoing with the faintest sounds he couldn't place. He had tried to move on. He had forced himself to move on. Friends had told him to seek therapy to find peace, but the truth was, Sam didn't know what peace even felt like anymore. How could he when every quiet moment felt like a threat? Every shadow could be the one that reached out and dragged him back into the darkness. The scars were there, inside and out. His hands trembled sometimes. The memory of Rachel's face, twisted in agony, her final breath lost in the wind. He would wake up in cold sweats, feeling the weight of her absence crushing him all over again. He had tried to replace her, tried to fill the hollow with work, with new faces, but it was never enough. Not even close. He stood at the kitchen window now, staring out at the evening fog creeping in, swallowing the streetlights. It was an unsettling stillness that settled over the neighborhood each night, like the calm before a storm that never seemed to break. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet, the emptiness, but tonight, it felt different. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sam turned away from the window, the whisper of his name catching his attention. He froze, his heartbeat accelerating as he scanned the room. There was nothing there, just the shadows. But the voice had been clear. Sam. His body reacted before his mind caught up, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. He reached for the nearest object, his coffee mug, shaking in his grip. It wasn't the same voice, not the one that haunted him before, but it was unmistakably familiar. His breath caught in his throat as he glanced around, knowing deep down that someone, was watching him. Was it back? He moved toward the front door, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he stepped into the hallway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He froze, hand hovering near the door frame as he pulled the phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking. A message from an unknown number. He opened it slowly, heart pounding. I'm waiting. The phone slipped from his hand as the blood drained from his face. His vision blurred as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, closer and closer. The door creaked open by itself, the air growing colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally, long. Sam's pulse quickened, his breath shallow as he took a step back, then another. He wanted to run, to scream, to get out, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. In the dim light of the hallway, he saw it. The figure, tall, faceless just like before, stood at the end of the corridor. Its outline was nothing but a silhouette, its presence suffocating the air. Its long fingers stretched toward him, the shadows pooling around its feet like an oily puddle. And then the voice again, but this time it was louder, closer, right next to his ear. You can never escape me, Sam. The room went cold. The "Mae whisper echoed around him, reverberating through his skull. His legs finally moved, breaking free of the paralysis that had held him. He turned and ran, his feet stumbling in the dark, his breath ragged in his chest. But the door that had once opened so easily, was locked. A soft tap came from behind him. Don't you remember? You can never leave. Sam turned slowly, dread rising in his chest like bile. The figure was closer now, the room spinning, around him. He blinked, desperate to convince himself it was just a hallucination, just his mind playing tricks on him. But when he opened his eyes, it was still there. The figure stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes staring at him with malicious intent. Sam's pulse raced as the world around him grew darker, the shadows stretching and creeping, pulling him deeper into the void. And then, everything went black. In the aftermath, there was no resolution, no happy ending. The horrors that had plagued Sam had only deepened, their grip tightening around him as he realized the truth. He had never truly escaped. It was always there, waiting, lurking in the dark, just beyond the edge of his awareness. The whispers never truly left, and as the world outside continued, oblivious to the terror that had consumed him, Sam knew he was never truly free. The epilogue leaves us with a chilling sense of inevitability. Sam may have survived, but he has not escaped. The curse continues, the whispers echoing in his mind as a reminder that the horror is never truly over. The final eerie moment, an unanswered phone message, a voice that calls him back into the darkness, suggests that no one can truly outrun their past or the darkness that haunts them. In the quiet town of Hollow Creek, life moved on as if nothing had ever happened. The streets were still, the trees still swayed in the wind, and the local cafe still brewed its morning coffee for the few residents who managed to wake before noon. Yet beneath this peaceful facade, something had changed. A month had passed since Sam disappeared without a trace. His house, once a symbol of a man trying to rebuild his life after tragedy, now stood abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its door left to rot on its hinges. His friends, once so hopeful he'd come out of the darkness that had consumed him, could only whisper about him in the streets, speculating, hoping, and yet never speaking the truth. But there were others too. Others who had heard the whispers. Those who had felt the cold shadows creeping in on them when they least expected it. Survivors, people who had experienced the same terror as Sam, yet hadn't been consumed by it. At least not entirely. They were beginning to find each other. One such survivor sat alone in a dim-lit apartment in the city. Her name was Nora, a young woman whose bright eyes once sparkled with ambition, now hollowed by the weight of a nightmare that never truly ended. She had moved far from Hollow Creek, thinking distance would protect her. But the truth had followed her here, just as it had followed every other victim who'd dared to look too deeply into the darkness. Nora had tried to move on, to forget the thing that had torn apart her world, the whispers, the shadowy figure that had stalked her every waking hour, dragging her deeper into a web of terror. But one night, just like Sam, the figure had returned, and now she sat, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the darkness to find her once more. Her trembling fingers hovered over a notebook filled with fragmented notes, each one a clue, a warning, a breadcrumb trail leading her to the truth of what she had encountered. The ritual, the curse, the whispers, they were all part of something bigger. Sam had been only one piece of the puzzle. The entity wasn't just haunting him, it was after all of them. And now, it was no longer confined to Hollow Creek. But just as Nora was beginning to connect the dots, something caught her attention. A tap at the window. Soft, almost imperceptible. She stood slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. The wind outside was calm, too calm. But the tap persisted. Tap, tap. She knew what it was. She knew who it was. The figure. The truth was undeniable now. It wasn't just Sam who had been marked. It wasn't just Hollow Creek. The curse, whatever it was spreading, infecting others, weaving a network of suffering. It had followed Sam to the city, to Nora's doorstep, and if it had found her, it was only a matter of time before it would move on to the next. Nora's breath hitched as she looked out the window. The street was empty, the night blanketed in an unnatural fog. But there, just beyond the edge of the streetlight, she saw it. The outline of the shadowy figure, its long limbs twisted in a grotesque parody of human form, standing motionless, watching her. Nora's heart raced as she grabbed her phone, desperate to call for help. But when she looked down at the screen, her blood ran cold. The message was simple yet terrifying. "It's too late for you, it's too late for all of you." Her pulse quickened, the air thick with dread as she backed away from the window. She couldn't run. It was inevitable now. The entity was a force, a presence that couldn't be escaped, a curse that spread like wildfire through anyone who dared to come too close. And as Nora stood there, frozen in fear, she knew this was just the beginning. The whispers would never stop. Elsewhere, in a remote town where the fog never seemed to lift, a young man named Jared was experiencing his own strange encounters. He had no idea what was waiting for him, but he would soon find out, and so would others across the globe, as the dark influence of the entity spread, gathering its strength, feeding on the grief, guilt, and fear of those unlucky enough to cross its path. The whispers would continue, the curse would persist, and as the shadow crept ever closer to those who were marked, there was no longer a question of if they would be consumed, only when. The legacy of the darkness was just beginning. The story ends not with a sense of closure, but with an eerie awareness that the horror is not an isolated event. It is a cycle, a force that travels, reaching its icy fingers into the lives of others. The lingering sense of fear is palpable, as we see that Sam was merely the first in a long line of victims. The darkness never ends, and there is no true escape, only the waiting. The true legacy of the whispers is one that will haunt anyone who dares to listen.